Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the School-Based Mental Health webinar. Today, we'll be addressing mindfulness, and we have the wonderful and the great Dr. Cristel Estrada. And I'm going to turn the time over to her so she can give an introduction of herself and begin the presentation.
Thanks, Corby. I really appreciate that. And thanks to Jerry, who's doing the technology, as well as Amanda, who's here as a cheerleader and going to monitor the interaction. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the education specialist over English learners, Title III, federal programs, refugees and immigrant students. My experience in teaching has been in elementary school, middle school, and high school, as well as at the university level in teacher education. And for the last, I would say, the last 9 years, I've worked specifically with the Stanford Cultivating Compassion training as a certified teacher from Stanford, looking at the issues related to self-compassion, compassion for others, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So let me give you the kind of overview of where we're going, and then we're going to stop in between. Because I'm going to start in a way that you're going to hear the voices of students. And so I'm hoping that you can ask questions, stop me anytime. I'll pose questions for you to think about. We'll actually do a mindfulness exercise. One of the things that I found the most helpful is that if adults model and practice mindfulness and show students how that helps them, then students understand that emotions are not dangerous, but we can self-regulate them by using strategies and practices that help us. So the overview really, and I try to put several things together because the way it's framed is it focuses on mindfulness as a basis of developing a growth mindset in relationship to becoming more resilient. So the first part of it, and this is kind of the framework, we're going to look at how mindfulness supports well-being, but we're going to start with the kids and the perspectives of students and children who have been educated and trained in using mindfulness strategies and the impact it has on their lives. So after I do the overview, I'm going to set up the context for listening to the students, and I'd like you to practice listening skillfully for particular purposes, and then we'll have a brief time where you can interact and make comments or ask questions. So that's the first part. The second part really is how the three systems in the brain affect emotional self-regulation. These systems of the brain are really important to understand, and I've tried to create visual representations and use really concrete ways for you to visualize and imagine how the brain systems interact with each other. And what are the triggers, the emotional triggers, in relationship to the kind of patterns that we establish. And as a consequence of the patterns, we actually think that that's our identity. And then the third point, I'm going to try to connect the whole idea of the three systems of the brain, and then how the practices create different kind of neural pathways and secrete different kinds of hormones that physiologically help us pretty much be happier, more well-balanced, and create the opportunity for becoming aware of more pro-social behaviors. And so the way I frame it is, if you change the brain, you free the mind, and when you do that, the mind can focus on growth, resiliency, emotional balance, and happiness, and the practices that support that. So that's going to be the overview of our time together. So the question is, what is mindfulness? And we're going to look at, from the kids' perspective, based on really listening carefully to their voices. So if you could listen with the purpose of identifying the key elements or anything that's significant in the way students talk about how the practices of mindfulness really helps them.
Helps you keep calm and relaxed when you're in times when you're angry or frustrated.
You learn from mindfulness so you can help yourself calm down. The red zone is when you're tense. My heart starts to beat fast and then I scrunch up my fist and also my face.
Your blood might be swishing around like a big wave coming over the ocean.
You can walk away, tell the teacher, or pause, breathe, and smile. PBS.
PBS stands for pause, breathe, and smile. Everything's moving the way it's supposed to be. Your heart's at a good rate. When you smile and just be happy,
it's where you're happy, you're never nervous, and you'll make friends.
You kind of just smell and feel what it's like, and then you just look at it and then you eat it.
Mandarinders.
Mindfulness makes me a better friend and sister. Before I didn't notice if people were feeling sad or lonely, but after I learned mindfulness, I noticed and I wanted to help.
Sometimes my brain is like a snow globe when you shake it up. It's stormy and wild, and I can't see things properly. Mindfulness helps me to calm down so I can see all the different snowflakes and understand what's happening in my mind.
Sometimes I lie in bed and I can't go to sleep because I'm worried about not getting high scores on my test. Pause, breathe and smile make me feel a lot calmer, and it will just help me fall asleep.
There's lots of little neurons in your brain, and your heart is actually connected to your brain. When you feel happy, you have a happy heart. Mindfulness gives you that happy heart.
Okay, so are there any comments or questions? Okay, since there are no comments, I'll just make a few. One of the things that you notice, and later on when we go through the presentation, there was one girl who said she has a hard time sleeping because she's worried about keeping her grades up. And this kind of level of anxiety related to expectation and external pressures activates the system of the brain that is really goal-oriented and goal-focused. So, you know, oftentimes we think motivation and goal setting is really important, and it is. But the question ends up becoming what happens when the message that children get is if they don't do well, then they're not good enough. And what does that really create in the way in which they interact with other people and also their own personal well-being? Okay, so here's the second video. The second video, the thing I'd like you to really focus on or think about, and maybe think about what's significant for you and what you learn differently, is about the students who actually, when they're talking about their physiology and they're talking about what happens in the brain, what kind of difference does it make for students who know how their brain functions?
I get really mad when my brother hits me a lot. I don't like it when you say you don't want to play with me.
When I'm mad, my brain can get a headache and it can start hurting.
Your blood keeps pumping because you're like really mad. And you start to get sweaty because you're getting really, really mad. And then when you start getting really mad, you turn red.
When your body can't really control yourself, mad just takes over your body. I just get out of control.
It's kind of like if you had a jar and then the jar would be your brain and then you put glitter in the jar and that would be how you would feel like. If you shook up the jar and the glitter went everywhere, that would be how your mind looks. And it's like spinning around and then you don't have any time to think.
And you sometimes punch stuff and people when you don't really mean it.
When I get angry, I feel it in my heart.
I really don't like when I get angry.
The amygdala really reacts, but the prefrontal cortex tries to keep it down. When I feel like I want to, get really angry and yell, I just sometimes, take deep breaths. First you find a place where you can be alone, then you find some way to relax and calm down. When I need to calm down, I take deep breaths. I breathe in through my nose. Sometimes I close my eyes or just take deep breaths.
It's calming down, it's not moving, it's slowing down and then it stops. And the heart pumps slow and then it goes into your brain.
It's like all the sparkles are at the bottom of your brain. My brain slows down and then I feel more calm and then I'm ready to speak to that person.
So, do you have any comments or questions in relationship to the things that students have said? Okay, so I'll make a comment in particular about this idea of understanding how the brain functions. You notice that children talked about the amygdala, so they understand that the amygdala is the part of the brain that regulates emotions. And the little girl also talked about the prefrontal cortex. Now, one of the reasons this is important is that there are strategies and techniques to support children in being self-regulating, as well as understanding their own emotional life, which is just critical. When we go on further, we'll see a longitudinal study that focused on kindergarten children and the impact of prosocial behaviors. Because remember, one of the key issues around mindfulness is the time and energy spent in being upset emotionally is used in becoming more aware of other people and other people's feelings and emotions. So we're going to look at the brain's three emotional regulation systems. And the reason this is important is that the brain has an emotional life. And the more we understand the emotional life of the brain, and that the practices and choices we make are not about this kind of typical excuse that adults generally make is, oh, I'm just that way, or I've always done it that way, or it's just my personality. Okay, generally there's no such thing as just a personality. In Richie Davidson's book, he does empirical research on neuroscience, and he looks from the scientific viewpoint of a continuum of experiences and mental events, and how it is we better regulate ourselves. So let's look at the three systems of the brain that interact with each other. So usually distress or trauma is caused by an imbalance in the way in which the systems interact with each other, because they're very interactive. So these are the emotional regulation systems. Paul Gilbert has created this graphic organizer to think about the ways in which human beings switch between these three systems to manage their emotions. And each system is really associated with different regions in the brain as well as different brain chemistry. The brain secretes different kinds of hormones, and those hormones have an impact on our actual physiology, so our health. And distress is caused by this imbalance between the systems. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is the extent to which these systems are regulated is the extent to which the soothing system is regulated. And we're going to look at ways in which you activate the soothing system. So the system that's the oldest, if you look at the red part, and you notice that the kids always talked about this idea of red being a way in which they're more activated. And the little girl talked about the amygdala. The hormones that are secreted are adrenaline and cortisol. When I was a kid, and my tendency is to be triggered and then angry. And usually what happens is the blood rushes down based on the adrenaline to your hands, and you can actually feel this experience of the fight impulse. Because, if you let yourself go, it would be very likely that, as the kid said, your intention is not to hit someone, but the chemistry and the adrenaline and the impulse that is triggered is what activates that. So the threat system is the oldest. It's the limbic system. It's the oldest system in the brain. That's why usually it's dominant. The purpose is it detects threats, or else we wouldn't be surviving. It's a protective mechanism, and the whole philosophy of the limbic system is, it's better safe than sorry, which either means fight or flight. So you're either going to run away or you're going to hit someone. And these feelings embedded in this system are anger, anxiety, disgust, and we'll talk a little bit about the triggers that trigger that system. Then the second system, well, that's kind of the first system because it's the oldest. The second system is the drive system, and the purpose is really to motivate us toward resources. Now, the reason why that's important is if you don't have sufficient resources, then obviously you're in danger of not surviving. So this impulse to gather resources and to move toward gaining things and setting goals creates in the brain, in a particular section of the brain, this experience of dopamine. And so those feelings are really about achieving, pursuing, wanting, progressing, a very ambitious system in relationship to thinking, if I don't get mine, then instantly the threat system is activated. The soothing system the purpose of the soothing system is to manage distress, promote bonding, or actual relationships and connections with other human beings. And the prefrontal cortex, as the little girl suggested, where executive functioning tends to happen and is developed later in development of a child, is what really supports this. And the extent to which the soothing system is activated is the extent to which the other two systems are in balance. The soothing system, which is interesting if you look at the chemistry in the brain, you have opiates and also oxytocin, which we'll talk about later. And these are the feelings that are contented, safe, protected, cared for, and trusted. So this system, when you think about what happens in classrooms or counseling situations or in homes, the self-soothing system is a very important system to know how to activate. So let's look at the first system. The first system, again, is the oldest, it's the limbic system. It's activated by the amygdala, which is really a tiny part of the brain. It's connected to hippocampus and memory, and the hypothalamus, which secretes hormones. And these hormones regulate every bodily function. So you realize how important this system of the brain is. And the stress hormones, as I said, were adrenaline and cortisol. Instantly, even though, and usually on an unconscious level, the purpose of it is to pick up these perceived threats. You perceive that you're threatened, and it creates these feelings of anxiety, fear, aversion, and it motivates you to either the fight or flight response. And again, the function is survive at all costs. And you can see where it's actually located in the limbic system. So when you look at system 1, we're still in the limbic system, and this goes back to what one of the young girls said. This system takes up a lot of mental and physical energy because it is interesting. The brain has this amazing capacity to imagine. And so while that's wonderful and good, it's also a problem. Because if the limbic system is in control, then imagining keeps the limbic system and the amygdala active and running, and cortisol and adrenaline keep being activated, even if there's not an external threat, because the brain has the capacity to imagine a threat even when it's not there. So what's the effect? The effect is that there's time, increased time, that is unnecessarily used in a state of threat. And so you're actually experiencing the world as exhausting and overwhelming. And I'm sure all of us have kind of had that feeling when there are all kinds of things going on. And we feel like whatever it is that's happening externally, is a danger. And it's, the thing about the senses is we do sense danger, but then the mind keeps it active. And so what's the impact? If you look at the visual image of the girl, and I picked this in particular because of the self-talk that happens and the kind of use of social media and the kind of bullying approaches that students take when they feel insecure and they need to objectify another person who's different than they are. So the impact is self-criticism, the inner critic, there's lots of shame, self-loathing, self-attacks, insecurity. So all of these are perpetuated by the adrenaline and the cortisol based on the limbic system. So how does the mind, and remember this is in your mind, so your mind is what triggers the threat system. So we're thinking about how it is we use practices to actually look at consciousness and observe what's going on with us, instead of reacting. And so let's look at some of the triggers. So the mind is amazing because it has the ability to be in the past and also in the future. And so regretting the past or thinking about the past or being anxious about the future is what keeps us from being present. Not only being in the present, but being present with people we're with. Now, this is a challenge because information that we get from the senses, is actually real. We see and hear an oncoming bus, and that tells us, if we don't get out of the way, we're going to get hit. Now, mental experiences, and some of you might have real serious questions about this, mental experiences are not real. Okay? They're just constructions of reality. They're not reality. And we create them. So how do we create them? We create them through our beliefs, our thoughts, images, daydreaming, judgments, predictions, rules, evaluations. It's the mind that triggers our threat system. It's what we think about that creates and triggers the threat system. So now you can stop me anytime if you have a question. Is there any questions about this? Okay, so here's some mental triggers. And I want you to think about the times when you've done this. This is just not about kids in a classroom. It's about colleagues at school. It's about administrative teams. It's about counseling meetings. It's about home life. It's about just the way in which we live our lives. So thinking about a problem that is insolvable. Now, as soon as you get stuck in thinking the problem is not solvable, you become agitated and stressed, right? So that's really that's the key. It's you're stuck in thinking that the problem is unsolvable. The next trigger is imagining a future where something bad will happen, or imagining situations where you will not be able to cope. And the emotional response is fear and anxiety. Now, there's actually a term for this in imagining a future. It's called anticipatory anxiety. And some of the research studies have shown at Emory University, at Harvard, not Harvard, at Stanford, at Emory, and Oxford, when they've done research, that anticipatory anxiety happens when you get in the habit of expecting the worst. So when kids wake up in the morning and they are anticipating a test, they're not going to be at their best, either for the test or getting up in the morning, or coming into the class and settling down. So there are all kinds of ways, as you saw by the video, a lot of physical exercise, using the breath to really support students in, all that chaotic movement of the glitter being settled so that you're back in a calm state of mind. Then another trigger is imagining failure or a confrontation or being abandoned. So again, if you notice, there's a common thread here and about being fearful. And imagining failure, I mean, you probably know some people who will say to you, in fact, somebody said this to me just like a couple of days ago. They said, I just hate confrontation. Well, part of the problem with hating confrontation and being fearful about it is not healthy. It's not healthy for you and for the relationships that you have with other people. So the question is, how do you self-regulate your emotions and use the kind of filters that help you create more pro-social behaviors and interactions that are not triggered by fear? So there are actually a lot of mental triggers. And I'm trying to make the point that the way in which emotion is triggered is mental experiences in your mind, right? And if you do them persistently, then it ends up becoming a habit, and you think that that's part of just who you are, right? That's just who I am. I have a short fuse. I have a bad temper. Okay, so no, it's not. It's about the way in which we use skills and strategies and learn from each other how to be self-regulating. And the only way we do that is becoming more aware, which is at the root of mindfulness. So memories of the past, sadness, shame, regret, thinking over and over about something. So this is, something makes you angry, and then instead of letting it go, it becomes a preoccupation. You know, you have an interaction with a class of students or with a group of counselors, somebody says something, you take it personally, and then you are preoccupied with it for like 3 weeks, and you can't let it go. Engaging in self-criticism. Now, this is really incredibly typical and mostly in Western cultures. This idea of this rugged individual and the nature of the comparing mind that judges other people either better than you or not good enough. And so then that ends up creating this environment in which you have a sense of shame, hopelessness, dislike for yourself, because you're not good enough. So it's this whole culture of perfectionism that causes, for so many people, and I found this out recently when I was working with a group at YWCA who work for domestic violence, is that, we have most of us know that we have a high suicide rate among 10 to 17-year-olds, one of the highest in the country. We also have a very high rate of suicide for young mothers. And so the health of the family is really critical in relationship to understanding kind of the emotional life and how we identify emotions, and then how we learn practices to self-regulate. Okay, so now we're going to go to, again, as we said before, we went over the threat system, which is the oldest and ends up being the one that's really, what can I say, the one that is dominant. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any comments or questions. Are there any comments or questions? Okay. So my intention is not to get you angry at your limbic system. It's the oldest and in some ways the wisest, because that's how we survive. We don't take chances unreasonably. But the problem is when you get hooked into always being fearful, then it colors the way in which you interact with everything. So let's look at the second system of the brain. And this is the brain's drive system. So it's really about striving, looking for resources, again, to ensure that, your own survival and the survival of your family. So this system, in order to reduce stress and feel good, your drive system secretes dopamine. So it's kind of a high, really. And it makes you feel really great. Now, the problem is that, unfortunately, while this feels really great, and people can get addicted to it, in a way that seeking out resources despite anybody else and thinking about yourself first ends up leading to being out of balance again. So here's an example. So individuals who are in this, what should we say, like the hamster wheel, it's the drive system, it's this relentless pursuit of achievement. And part of the issue is it ends up being, in order to feel better about oneself. Now remember, the idea of a self, you've just constructed. There is no such thing really as a self. It's the ideas that you have about who you are, right? And so then as a consequence, in this endless pursuit of acquisition or resources or whatever it happens to be, reputation, you can experience stress because there's always a threat of failing that can trigger feelings of the inner critic. And so what does that do? See, as soon as that happens, then the limbic system is active again. And you're more open to depression, to shaming, your experience of you as not being good enough. So I use this picture purposely because when we get stuck in habitual patterns of thinking about ourselves in a particular way, or thinking about others who are not like us in a particular way, or in the world. We think about the world in a specific way, as if it is the right way. This causes suffering because we're stuck in our thoughts about it. It's not the way we really are or can be, and it's not the way other people really are, and it's not the way the world really is. It's the mental experiences, it's our thinking about all of those things. So, again, distress is caused by imbalance between these systems, and it's caused by the underdevelopment of the soothing system. So let's look at the self-soothing system. So being in balance to activate the self-soothing system. The self-soothing system manages distress. It promotes bonding. You feel connected to other people. So here's some activities in relationship to what you could do. And you saw it in the video. This is how you activate the self-soothing system. And if people wonder why, in a counseling session or in a classroom, you're having kids do jumping jacks, or you're having them do breath control, or you're helping them, do visualizations to be in nature, or you're taking them on a nature walk. Here are the reasons for doing this kind of activity. Not talking about it, but actually doing it. So children are really, when they're anxious, there's some students who are really anxious about their learning, about their abilities, about their homework, pretty much about anything. There are kids who are just anxious, and adults as well. And so that means that their levels of cortisol associated with stress are very high. Now, while cortisol has some benefits, this perpetual state or spikes in these levels, are really damaging to the body because it puts stress on the body, and including cognitive abilities, the inability to focus. It's like the glitter in the jar that's all chaotic. So as educators, we need to discover how our own behavior and expectations of students affect students. Now, this is a challenge for adults, for many adults. The easiest way to do this is to create safe learning conditions where you consistently get feedback from your students. When I was a high school teacher, I had students really, in every single activity that we did, they always did a debrief. We did a debrief to find out what worked for them, what didn't work for them, what are they now thinking, because debriefing activities and helping them better be metacognitive about their actual learning experiences and how those experiences make them feel are really important. One way you can do this is always ensure that there are opportunities for kids or for adults or for any group that you work with to give you feedback, and never take it as somehow personal, but a way that as a community, and especially in school communities, that we're communicating and learning with each other and from each other. And that's what an inclusive environment is like. So, the counter effect of this outside stressors hinder actually what happens in the classroom. When parents and families come to the school and they meet a secretary who is not welcoming, it doesn't ever really set a tone for creating inclusive environments that mitigates, the threat system. That's what triggers the threat system. When people feel not appreciated, less than. Susan Fisk's work from Harvard is very clear about, from Princeton is very clear about this. When our mind is always comparing, and we compare ourselves to others, we either, and this is her language, we either envy up those people that we perceive as better than we are, so we envy them, whether they do anything or not, we envy them, and those that we perceive as less than us or not as good as we are, our tendency is to scorn down. This is her language, which means we look at others And when we're comparing, we're using the comparing mind, the judging mind, then the way in which we treat those people ends up being like an object, right? We objectify them. And so examples that are used in Susan Fisk's study at Princeton are, the example is homeless people, because then it justifies the way in which we treat other people if we compare and judge them. Okay, so let's look at this next piece, which is, okay, so here are the range of self-soothing activities, and as you saw in the video, one is movement, fidgeting, by building time during transition. So when there are transitions from, subject to subject, or even when you're working with students in a counseling situation, and they come in, if you have a culture, if you create a culture, and some schools do this. I know Emerson has all the students, they have the faculty and students who are trained, and some schools in Granite, many schools really use mindfulness as a way to create a more welcoming and safe environment. So you heard the kids' definition of mindfulness. Oh, here's another definition of mindfulness that I think helps us in a broader way. So mindfulness is the act of consciously focusing the mind on the present moment without judgment. Okay, so that's the key. Without judgment. So how do you do that? The only way you can do this is you have to practice. And because of the way in which you practice, my suggestion is that it's a great way to start every morning. If you practice in the morning and then at night before you go to bed, it establishes a rhythm and a kind of new neural networks. So we're actually gonna try it. Before we try it, though, we're gonna see if are there any comments or questions?
Not so far.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to lead you through just a few minutes of mindfulness. So I'm going to ask you to sit in a relaxed position with your feet on the ground. Now, the reason I'm saying sitting in a relaxed position is that only you can know what's the most relaxing for you. Right? So there's no right way to do this. Because as soon as you get stuck in thinking there's a right way, then you're back into this idea of, there's a perfect way to do this and I have to get to that. So you sit in a relaxed position with your feet on the ground. And like the kids in the video, you're going to take in deep breaths through your nose, feeling your diaphragm expand as the air comes in, and as you exhale through the mouth. And when you exhale, you're going to let go of all your thoughts, all your stress, all the tension in your body. So we're just going to right now take about 4 breaths, deep in through your nose, and out through your mouth. In through your nose and out through your mouth. After 4 deep breaths, you're going to begin to breathe normally. And as you exhale, on each exhale, you're going to count. So you're going to breathe in normally, and on your exhale, you're going to count 1. And you're going to breathe in and then exhale and count 2. Now you're going to do this for 10 until you reach 10. And when a thought comes up, you're just going to notice it. And then you're going to go back to your breath. You're not going to let the thought take you off. And you're not going to blame yourself for having a thought. You're just going to watch it and notice it as it comes up, and then you're going to go back to your breath. So we'll do that for a few seconds. Okay, so one suggestion of developing a practice is setting your watch and taking deep breaths like every hour, and then counting to 10, and just practice watching your thoughts without being sucked into them or blaming yourself because you have a thought. So I'd suggest that a very simple way to begin, and if you saw it with the students, this is a really important way to alleviate anxiety and stress and help students be mindful not only of their own feelings and emotions, but how their body feels, and also their awareness of other people. So this is one of my favorite pictures. It's pretty simple. Mindfulness is being in the present. And if you notice, this picture is so spectacular because it says, "This is why the dog is happy." You look at the dog and the person who's sitting there. Here's this great experience of being out in nature, which, by the way, is the best indicators for mental well-being and healthy well-being, and a sense of being connected. And recent research, it was about 2 weeks ago, came out about having a dog, and the relationship of longevity in relationship to people who have dogs tend to live longer. And if you have dogs with children, children's immune system is stronger when they have a dog and other pets. So if you look at the dog, where's the dog? The dog is where the dog is, and the dog is with the person. I mean, the dog is in the present. Where's the man? The man is thinking about traveling, the car, the home, money, right? So he's really not in the present. So which of the two is the happiest? Or the happier, I should say. Okay, the dog. Now, one of the goals of cultivating compassion is to be happy. You know, life is short, and the question is, how do we cultivate happiness? So let's look at the next part. Daily mindfulness practices, and if you can see by the whole kind of presentation, mindfulness practices really help us not be in our head about things, you know, like the man next to the dog, and stuck in our own mental experiences or our ideas, either about ourselves or about others who are not like us. Now, the reason this is important is when you think of creating an inclusive school environment, these practices are important in relationship to pro-social behaviors and becoming aware of other people. So one of the skills is, it's called listening without judgment. And the reason listening without judgment is important is that typically the way in which we listen to people is inside of us there's Otto Scharmer, who talks about leading from the future as it emerges. He talks about the voice of the judge. He actually talks about 3 voices that end up interfering with the way in which we are with other human beings. So the first voice is the voice of the judge. And the way in which we listen is always about judging. So I'm going to encourage you this week, and you can email me. I have an email at the end. If you notice how you're listening to others. Now, listening without judgment is a way to develop perspective taking, which takes place in a section of the brain that is connected to developing empathy. So I really like this visual, which you could blow up and put it in your room or in your office. It's the filters that people can use when they're self-regulating in relationship to uh, the way in which they're thinking about talking based on how they're listening to other people. So if you look at it, the first part is I use my judgment to decide if my words need filtering. You set an intention, right? So am I saying this? Why am I saying what I'm saying? What is the intention that I have? Choice. Is this something that needs to be said? See, what happens if it's not said? I go through this all the time in many situations. Now, compassion. Can I try understanding how another person feels? This is more kind of perspective taking, which is at the root of compassion. Empathy. Can I try to see what happened through the other person's point of view? And then the question is, will this embarrass the other person? Is there a better way, time, or place to say this? Did I listen properly? Did I give the other person a chance to explain or even apologize? So part of this issue is in relationship to asking clarifying questions or reframing something. These are just skills. These are skills to practice, especially in situations where you feel that you're being triggered emotionally. And then, are my words respectful? How would I feel if someone said this to me? So again, this whole way of listening in relationship to not listening to the voice of the judge. So I'm going to suggest listening as the voice of the one who's curious. You're curious and you want to find out more about the other person. So when our self-soothing system is activated, we can manage stress, and it increases our capacity for connection. So these pictures are pictures of high school students from East High School at Franklin Elementary School. They've written children's books in multiple languages about subject areas, so social studies, science, different kinds of things, how to get along with other people, and they are down at Franklin Elementary and they're reading their books. Now, the whole point of this idea is that what are the ways in which a school environment creates and encourages a capacity to connect to others? What does that look like? Now, the reason oxytocin is really important, it's a hormone that is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and so it regulates social interaction. And this hormone is the basis for trust and feeling a sense of being trustworthy. Others are trustworthy, and I have the ability to trust them. So there's this bonding and connection. This, of all other hormones, is an antidote to depressive feelings, because depression, those feelings are one of isolation. Fear, loneliness, isolation, hopelessness. So this experience of pro-social behaviors and the way in which this happens in every environment in a school community is really important. And a key to this is transparent and clear and thoughtful communication. So it supports these pro-social behaviors, and combined with mindfulness supports a growth mindset. I can give you all these other kinds of resources if you're interested. All you have to do is email me at the end. Now, there's an effort rubric that has indicators in relationship to the qualities of growth mindset. And the growth mindset only happens when we feel safe to do certain kinds of things. Google did this research, and of course they spent, tons of money on it. And their question was, what are the qualities and characteristics of the most innovative teams to create the most innovative and futuristic products? And believe it or not, there was only one characteristic that created innovative teams, and it was listening without judgment in relationship to creating a safe environment to provide whatever ideas that you have. So a complete open environment in which people listen without judgment, and the conditions for safety did these things. And this is Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset: to take on challenges, to learn from mistakes, to accept feedback and criticism, to persevere by focusing on a task, by asking questions, and by taking risks. Learning only happens when safe environments create the opportunity for authentic communication where people ask questions and take risks and they feel safe doing it. So how do we develop this capacity for a growth mindset and resiliency? So it's a simple answer, but it's challenging. It's to understand the emotional life of our own brain. And I would suggest that you download this. This is a grump meter. And the grump meter shows, it's an app, and I use it before stressful meetings as well, and I know a lot of people here use it. Blue is the sense of calm. And one of the reasons this is important is that young people can identify how they're feeling and name the emotions that help them get to blue, which is feeling calm. And you saw this in the video with the kids. Green is a way that they start feeling perhaps a little anxious, and the goal is to help them figure out why those emotions are there and why they're feeling that, what's triggering them outside, and how they can use their breath to get back to blue. Then you have yellow, which is, this caution about your feelings, and then you go to orange, and you notice a lot of the kids were talking about red. Most of the research that's done on this with the social worker and the Kaufman family, Janet and Lynn Kaufman, when people get to red, there is no control, right? And that's what one of the kids in the video said. And it's to the point where you don't intend to hurt people, but you do it anyway. So this is an app, and it's called the Grump Meter. It's very simple. I've seen kids in elementary school. I tutored kindergarten kids, and I went into the school to check in at the office, and the usual suspects were in the principal's office, and I asked them, "Oh, so why are you here?" And one student said, "Well, I was getting to green, and then he was on yellow, and we were like back and forth, and our teacher went to red and threw us out of the room." And this is a kindergarten student. So there were other families who have used this and have done really well, and there was an article in the Tribune about it, and also on KSL, where when families use it, they begin to figure out how to name the emotions that they're feeling and what's triggered them, and then make a decision how they're going to respond. So the Grump Meter is just a really simple, concrete way to help kids develop language around what they're feeling, and then how they can use strategies to calm themselves down. There was a 20-year longitudinal study from Penn State and the Duke University. It started in the 90s, and it was kindergarten children. Kindergarten children who have strong social skills are more likely to thrive as adults, and this is what the data shows. They tracked them over 20 years. They're twice as likely to attain a college degree in early adulthood, 54% more likely to earn a high school diploma, and 46% more likely to have a full-time job by the age of 25. Now, while these statistics, we would hope that they would be higher, we do see that prosocial behavior can be learned at a very early age. So how can we cultivate compassion for self and others? These are practices to reduce social anxiety. Now, social anxiety is not that I'm afraid of other people. It's I become very anxious about what I'm thinking other people are thinking about me. So this has nothing to do with me not liking other people. It's about what I'm perceiving that other people are thinking about me. So when I went to do tutoring in the kindergarten class, and this was in October, or the end of September, it was, the first month of school, and I was tutoring a little boy. And one of the things he said to me was, well, I really can't read because I'm stupid. Now, think about this. This is a kindergarten kid who's only been in school for a month. He already has ideas about what other people are thinking about him, and now what he's thinking about himself. So this is the developmental steps of the Stanford's program. It's called Cultivating Compassion, and it's at the medical school at Stanford. So the first one, and remember it's developmental. You have to really learn how to focus your attention through mindfulness. So that's why I'm encouraging you to really practice mindfulness. Step 2 is loving kindness and compassion for a loved one. Now you can see developmentally, this is an important one because this is an easy thing to do. You have an image of a loved one, and the kind of way in which you interact with that person is, you think about the loved person, the one that you love, and may you be happy and free from suffering. Now, the part about may you be happy is wishing another person happiness, which is a sense of loving kindness. So that's what loving kindness means. Free from suffering is compassion. The only way you can be compassionate, and of course, in Eastern thought in particular, compassion is endless. There is no limit to compassion. So the idea of compassion is that you become aware of someone else's suffering, and whether you act on it or not, you have the impulse to alleviate their suffering. That's what compassion is. Step 3 is loving kindness for oneself. An easy phrase to remember is, and this is not selfishness, right? This is really important. May I be happy. So I encourage you to really focus on this instead of making judgments about you not being good enough or not being perfect enough or being selfish or whatever. So loving kindness for oneself. Step 4 is compassion for oneself, which is very challenging. In the Stanford course, we have 2 full weeks on loving kindness and compassion for oneself. And may I be free from suffering. So this is an opportunity for you to figure out how you activate the self-soothing system by visualizing someone who has always loved you unconditionally and understands you completely with no judgment. And the last step is compassion for others, which is developing awareness of a common humanity. And I do this actually in the airport. So I look at different people in the airport. And sometimes I do it in really tough situations where I'm angry my tendency might be to be angry at certain people because of their viewpoints. And I try to cultivate this, which is just like me, you want to be happy and free from suffering. So these are really simple ways in which you can practice cultivating, cultivating empathy, cultivating compassion, cultivating loving kindness, and helping students do that as well. So what is our task and responsibility for children in Utah to support youth and their families? It's just working together to make each school culture inclusive, develop our own practices of mindfulness and self-compassion. That's really as adults. Those are the goals. Working with each other to create an inclusive culture that's welcoming to a wide range of diverse students. And I would recommend Krista Neff's work. You can go online and look up her work and take the self-compassion survey that she does. And you might be surprised at how you're not very used to activating the self-soothing system and how much that puts you in danger, as well as people that you love and people around you. So what questions and comments do you have? We have about 20 minutes.
You can even tell them if they want to unmute their mic, they can even ask the question.
Oh, and also you can unmute your mic and ask questions. Then we could hear you if you'd like to do that. And you can ask any question. Remember, there are no bad questions and there are no silly questions. There are always good questions.
If no one
Also, if you want, I have an annotated bibliography and some other resources to support the work that you want to do. And if you want to, let's see, if you want to email me, I thought I put it on the slide, but yeah, she'll share it in the chat. You can email me at christelle.estrada@schools.utah.gov. And I have all kinds of resources. And if you're interested, usually in the spring, I teach the 8-week Stanford Cultivating Compassion course for a wide range of, educators, counselors, social workers, to really get more deeply into your own practice and see how that has an impact in relationship to not only the work that you do with colleagues, but also the way in which you interact with students. Okay, so if there are no questions, I just want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share these these resources that could help you develop not only your own practice, but also the well-being of your school culture and school community.
So thank you very much for your participation in the school-based mental health webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in January for our next webinar. Please enjoy your holiday, travel safe, and see you next year.